Hello, you are all very welcome to this session. I am Ruth Hegarty and I'm the independent chair of Words Ireland. Just checking first of all that you can all hear me. Can I get a thumbs up from you, Peter, that you can hear me fine? And Paul, thank you very much. We're delighted to have you all here. As some of you will know, Words Ireland is an informal grouping of 7 literature organisations: Poetry Ireland, Literature Ireland, Publishing Ireland, Children's Books Ireland, the Irish Writers' Centre, Munster Literature Centre and Stinging Fly. And we all welcome you to this session. First of all, I just want to flag, as you see when you came in, that we are live streaming and recording this session. And although we'll be following the speaker view for the recording, can't guarantee that you won't appear in the recording. So if you'd like to turn off your video, if you don't want your face to appear, please do so. But it is also nice for the speakers to see people. So if you want to leave it on, if you're happy with that, feel free to do that. So let's get started. In 2021, Words Ireland embarked on an equality, diversity and inclusion initiative supported by the Arts Council. We began by carrying out the first major survey of writers and illustrators in Ireland in over a decade. And the anonymous information that we gathered, supplied by many of you who are here today, will feed efforts to improve the pay and working conditions of writers and literature workers for years to come. It will also identify barriers to being published or working in the literature sector that underrepresented groups may face. In addition to the survey, as part of this programme of activities, Words Ireland commissioned Nolene Hartigan, an independent consultant who works in the area of strategy, diversity and rights, to support our thinking about how we engage with the issues of diversity across the 7 organisations. And one element of that work was to create a charter for inclusion for our organisations that makes clear our commitment to rights, diversity, equality and inclusion. So we've consulted with our own organisations and with our advisory group on the content of the charter. And between now and the start of December, we will be taking feedback on it from the wider sector through a series of webinars. And at the end of this session, Nolene is going to join us to outline that process and give us a quick sneak peek of the charter. But this session is about the survey results. And the survey that we carried out on understanding the pay, conditions and diversity in the literature sector, the results have been complex and they're going to take time to digest. So we decided to share them first with the sector and with policymakers, and we're going to publish the report today on the Words Ireland website. What we really wanted to do was to open a conversation with all of you, with writers, with policymakers, and with those who work in the sector. And Heather Maitland, who worked with us, she's an arts consultant, and she helped design the survey, and she's going to present the results first of all. And after that, I'll go to some individuals initially, like the writer Paul McVeigh, who's also the acting head of literature for ACNI now, and Aoife Walsh, commissioning editor at New Island, and then on to Toby Dennett, who's the strategic development manager at the Arts Council, to tease out some of these questions that are arising from different perspectives, the writer, the publisher. And after that, I hope that you will all join in the conversation, and it's an opportunity to ask questions, to tease out with Heather, maybe you wanted to know a little more about, and to start to think about the implications and what we can do. So first of all, then, I am going to hand over to Heather, who is going to guide us through this survey and the findings. And after that, we'll have an opportunity to tease it out. Over to you, Heather, now.
Thank you so much, Ruth. I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. Hurrah. This has been such an interesting process. It's been so useful to work so closely with the Words Ireland committee and also with the expert panel who've created a real richness to this research. The full report is long. It's a 50-pager, gulp. But that's because there's so much really rich stuff in it. So what I'm going to do is a quick gallop through the key findings. I'm really kind of trying to tell a story that I think means something particularly to me and hopefully to you, but there's loads more things to think about and look at. I'm going to start by just very briefly talking a little bit about the research and the difficulty of researching diversity in particular. I'm going to look at the profile in terms of diversity of the literature and publishing sector, focus on barriers to engagement, briefly look at the key ideas suggested by the survey respondents in terms of overcoming those barriers, and then do a very quick personal conclusion of what I think is the key thrust of what the findings are telling us. So I'm going to launch straight in. So this was really interesting because there was the membership of Words Ireland is so diverse that there were a huge range of priorities coming from the groups. But really what we were doing is trying to collect robust evidence. And that was around diversity, but also barriers to entry and engagement in general. And then looking at how that specifically affected or disproportionately affected excluded groups. And I want to say a huge thank you to the 545 writers and illustrators who responded, and to the over 100 sector workers who gave valid responses. It's just worth pointing out that we had twice that number of responses from sector workers, people working for publishers and literature organisations. However, half of them dropped out of the survey quite early on, as soon as they saw questions around their own career development. And we're not quite sure why that is, and are going to be exploring that in a bit more detail. This was an Arts Council funded project, and we focused on the equality, human rights and diversity groups identified in the Arts Council's own EHRD policy. There was one, though, that we found very, very difficult to define, socioeconomic background, and that's largely around how that's dealt with in general kind of research. So it's best tackled through qualitative research with people self-identifying their class and the focus of their work. We also had an interesting discussion around how we look at career stage for writers and illustrators. I mean, sector workers, it's easy because we can just simply say, how many years have you been working in the sector, and have a really good sense of where they sit in terms of their career. But writers and illustrators, we very rapidly discovered, can start their career and hit the key milestones in their career development at any age, from 6, which was the earliest anybody was published, through to 85, which was the latest that anybody was published. So we defined it by two ways, whether they're seeking to earn income from their writing or illustrating, and whether they've been published or not. So all the way through, I'm going to be referring to aspiring writers who are not seeking to earn income and are pre-published, emerging writers who are pre-published but are looking this year, and by that we meant 2021, we're trying to earn income, and then people who were published, and we've looked at that in terms of the number of books that they've had published. Now, we did define it like that. We did define books very carefully, and we discovered, thanks to feedback from writers, that people who focus on short forms such as poetry and short stories don't fit into those categories. So in future, we need to look at that again. So here we go. It's really complicated researching diversity, and I'm going to talk about that as we go through, because there are all sorts of different aspects that make it very complicated. The first of which is that people really dislike being categorized. So 31% of writers and illustrators and 11% of sector workers did not answer the diversity monitoring questions. Now, the panel and the committee knew that that was going to happen. So we asked whether people felt happy answering those questions. And 2/3 of writers and illustrators said that they were happy depending on what the information was going to be used for, or were just happy to answer them regardless. So that really matches the people who didn't want to respond. However, we know from their responses, particularly the qualitative responses, that many writers and illustrators who we would have categorized as from underrepresented groups did not answer those questions. So what we've had to do is when I'm talking about underrepresented groups and writers and illustrators and sector workers from groups who are not underrepresented, we're focusing only on the people who answered those questions. However, when I'm talking about all respondents, I'm talking about everybody regardless of whether they answered those questions or not. It made it a bit more complicated than perhaps it might otherwise have been. So let's leap into the sector profile. I'm going to gallop through this. So how do we tell if somebody is a particular group is underrepresented or not? Well, the best way is finding a benchmark around the population and saying, is there a greater or lesser proportion within our survey samples? So 14% of the population were identified in the census as being deaf or having a disability. And actually, the census uses a very medical-based model, asking people about their impairments. And that's really, I think, considered inappropriate by a lot of people within the deaf and disability communities. So we asked a question that asked people to self-identify, which is a social model of disability. And actually, people with disability were underrepresented among sector workers and underrepresented among mid-career and established writers and illustrators. So they were fairly well represented amongst aspiring and emerging writers and illustrators. So, ethnicity and cultural background. Well, I dislike doing this, but people from ethnic and cultural groups of all sorts, apart from white Irish and any other white backgrounds, were so underrepresented that I've lumped everybody together. We're using here the census categories about ethnic group and cultural background, and not everybody feels that they're appropriate. But 6% of the population of Ireland in 2016 were from ethnic and cultural groups other than white Irish and any other white background. And those groups are dramatically underrepresented, both among writers and illustrators and among sector workers. So LGBTQIA, and again, it's probably inappropriate to lump everybody together. And also the research data around the population is not particularly helpful. The government did some research, and the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development did some research across Europe, and we've got answers ranging from between 2% and 11% of the population. Actually, if you take all these communities in one lump, they are well represented amongst writers and illustrators and sector workers. However, it is not a homogeneous group. And we could see from other responses across the survey that particularly transgender people and people not identifying as binary are very underrepresented. So I'll look at that a little bit more later on. Family status, well, actually this is really around caring responsibilities. So we looked at literally whether people said that they had caring responsibilities for family or friends, and that's defined as providing personal help. And actually carers are well represented across the whole of the sector. However, if we look at parents, and there's certainly been a lot of work in Ireland around exclusion of artists who are parents, we identified that actually there was good representation of all parents except for those aged 5 to 11. And that was particularly the case amongst writers and illustrators. In terms of gender, very surprisingly, men were underrepresented throughout. So they represent 49% of the population, but 37% of our responders who were writers and illustrators, and 22% who are sector workers. And then another surprise was religion. So in the population census in 2016, 81% identified as Roman Catholic. However, life has moved on since then, and only 22% of writers and illustrators and 27% of sector workers identified as Roman Catholic. And that's because the proportion identifying as having no religion was pretty much 4 times that within the census at 63% and 65%. So that's the profile, some surprises for us there. But what does it all mean? Well, we had to define what underrepresented was going to mean for this survey, because the proportion of underrepresented groups was so small, it was difficult to get a robust sample. And one of the key aims of this was to get evidence that we could base both the work that Noeline's doing in terms of improving equality and diversity, and in terms of the Words Ireland's advocacy. We needed robust data, and to do that, what we wanted was to define a group that we could say was definitely underrepresented within our sector rather than generally. Now, that doesn't mean that other groups who are minority groups are going to be ignored in the diversity action plans and the work that comes out of this project. So this is just purely about identifying where underrepresented groups have specific barriers and specific issues that they are affected by disproportionately. So this is how we defined are underrepresented groups for the purposes of this statistical analysis. So people with, who are deaf or have a disability, ethnic groups other than white Irish or any other white background, those identifying as non-binary, transgender, or with gender identities other than male or female, parents of children aged 5 to 11, and for sector workers only under 24s. And you can see that actually we can start to make some really interesting analyses. So writers and illustrators who are aspiring and established have a much lower proportion of the underrepresented groups than emerging and mid-career writers and illustrators. So that's kind of interesting that it's at both ends of the career path there. But I do want to talk about the difficulty of analysing diversity. You know, what does this thing of underrepresented really mean? So it really is complicated. You know, underrepresented groups are really diverse. And I'm going to illustrate that by looking at career paths of sector workers. So if you look at the least experienced and the most experienced people within the sector who responded to the survey, underrepresented groups, 22% have been working for a year or less within the sector, and only 5% of those not from underrepresented groups. But it's also true the other end. So 30% of those responding were from underrepresented groups, had been in the sector for 20 or more years, and 28% of those from not from underrepresented groups. So it's interesting that underrepresented groups have carved out really effective careers for themselves. So we can't call all underrepresented groups as having barriers to development in their careers. And it also is very clear from the research that underrepresented does not mean disadvantaged. So no action will ever be relevant to everyone in an underrepresented group. So the Words Ireland members are going to have to look very carefully at responding to individuals rather than lumping everybody together in a homogenous kind of making assumptions that everyone's alike. I mean, I'm going to show you an example around total gross income from all sources. So underrepresented groups, the median, that's the midpoint. So if we line everybody up and pick the person in the middle, 22,000 euros. So half of those from underrepresented groups earn less than that, and half earn more than that. And actually it's lower for those not from underrepresented groups. And again, that's because writers and illustrators from underrepresented groups have carved out really effective careers for themselves. So the top earner was earning in 2019 125,000 euros in that year. And actually there were a lot who earned nothing at all from their writing or illustrating, and nothing at all from other sources of income. So actually we need to interrogate that, which I'll do later on. And we really, really need to look behind the statistics and ask why. So here's an example. Time pressure was mentioned spontaneously by a lot of writers and illustrators that was impeding their careers. So if we look at the respondents who said that they could spend at least 3/4 of their working hours writing, underrepresented groups, there are more of them, twice as many who say they can do that compared to those not from underrepresented groups. But of course, that's because a lot of those from underrepresented groups cannot work in terms of paid work. It's the reason why they're in underrepresented groups is because they cannot work. For example, migrant writers and illustrators are not allowed to work for a certain number of years. So it's complicated. However, it stopped being complicated as soon as we started looking at barriers, because the barriers, it turns out, are common to the majority of writers and illustrators and the majority of sector workers right across our sample. So let's look at the first of these, low income. And this was, I found this really unnerving. I found it completely unexpected. So we're looking at this in the context of a 5.6% growth in the economy in 2019, where the national average earnings went up by an incredible 21% from 2018. So we're looking at growth within the economy, and that growth is just simply not seen amongst writers and illustrators or sector workers. So if we look at their annual average earnings from all sources, not just their writing and illustrating or their work for sector organisations, in 2019, emerging mid-career and established writers and illustrators earned 25,600 and a bit euros, and sector workers earned 30,600 and a bit euros. So writers and illustrators earn 63% on average of the national average earnings, and sector workers earn 76% of that. So if we look at that in terms of the numbers of writers who are earning at either end of that, 50% earn less than 20,000 a year from all sources, and 9% of writers and illustrators earn more than 60,000. So let's look at underrepresented groups compared to those known not to be from underrepresented groups. And we looked at this earlier, didn't we? Underrepresented groups, the median is actually above that for those known not to be from those groups. And the high earners are from groups right across those underrepresented groups. So it's not like, I don't know, it's not like people with children are the ones who are earning lots. There are people earning above that from right across all of those groups. Let's look at the median gross income from creative work in 2019. And I've picked out the mid-career and the established writers and illustrators because they're probably people who we would expect to make a decent living from their creativity. So from creative work, the median gross income was just €2,000. So half of all mid-career and established writers and illustrators earn less than that. And from related work such as teaching, the median gross income was €1,000. And again, half of all writers and illustrators who are in their mid-career or who are established earn less than that from related work. So that's a frightening statistic. If we look at sector workers, half of all sector workers earn less than €29,000 from all sources, and just 7% earn more than 60,000. So why is pay so low? Well, we asked a lot of open qualitative questions and tried not to prompt people so we could actually see what people felt was going on. And it became clear that for sector workers, they were so aware that the sector was small and therefore the market was small, so that there were few opportunities for career progression and people stayed in jobs for a long time. So competition for jobs was incredibly fierce and people were willing to take very low salaries and poor pay and conditions in order to get jobs. And the economic model contributes to that. So a small market, it's very fragmented. The sector does not have very much bargaining power because it's so fragmented. And so things like discounting makes it actually very difficult for organizations, publishers in particular, to make it all work. And then for other kinds of organizations, they're dependent on funding. And actually, we know what happened to funding up until the pandemic, when actually support for a lot of organizations was extremely welcome. And for writers and illustrators, it's the same issues. You know, it's a small market, so only small publishers can take risks, partly because they get funding. But small publishers, because of that funding, which tends to suppress fees, they can't afford to pay writers and illustrators properly. So there's the most intense competition for the available opportunities. And you know, a lot of these organizations, and indeed the writers and illustrators, want to rely on funding in order to prop up their earnings. So that was 2019, which we focused on as the last kind of, in inverted commas, normal year. Let's look at what happened as a result of the pandemic. We've got lots of data about this, but I just want to pick out one illustrative set of statistics. So this is about what happened to writers and illustrators' income. So for underrepresented groups, it dropped by 18%. So this is their income from all sources. And those not from underrepresented groups, it fell by just 7%. And if we look at their their earnings from work not related to writing or illustrating, that's where the collapse happened. So 29% drop there, and 0% for those, it stayed static for those not from underrepresented groups. And that's because it would appear that the kind of flexible work that those from underrepresented groups can take, that enables them to do at least some writing / illustrating, just disappeared during the pandemic. So this means that writers and illustrators and sector workers are reliant on other sources of income. So 66% of writers and illustrators from underrepresented groups, but 72% from those not from underrepresented groups relied on work that was not related to their writing or illustrating. 28% of sector workers, 33% of those writers and illustrators who are from underrepresented groups, and 24% not from underrepresented groups relied on financial support from family, friends, or another member of their household to enable them to write or do their illustrating work, or both. And there was a thing particularly for sector workers working in Dublin, where they needed to stay with parents or friends just simply to afford to work in Dublin. And I think this need to have a portfolio of income in order to be able to afford to work in the sector, either as a writer or an illustrator or as a sector worker, actually means that a significant proportion are relying on temporary work, variable hours, or self-employment in order to earn an income. 41% of sector workers and 66% of writers and illustrators rely only on income from precarious employment. And that has a huge impact. So 40% of sector workers and 26% of writers and illustrators don't have a mortgage and don't own their own home. So they're relying on renting, which has huge implications for the future. Another huge implication for the future is that 23% of sector workers and 20% of writers and illustrators do not have a pension, and 35% of sector workers who did, and 46% of writers and illustrators made no contributions in 2019. So, it's fairly pointless having a pension if you can't contribute to it. A particular issue for sector workers that we could measure, but from qualitative responses, this is true also for writers and illustrators, which is that they're prevented from getting into the sector because they can't afford to work for free. So we can measure this for sector workers. None of those from underrepresented groups got their first paid job following unpaid work, either as a placement or volunteering, whereas 21% of those not from underrepresented groups used that as their doorway into the sector. Time pressure is another issue that was preventing people getting into the sector. That's because they need to work in other ways in order to, not within the sector, in order to earn a living and to survive. So 25% of writers and illustrators said that time pressures were preventing them develop their career. They, for example, they were unable to do the final edit before submission for, say, a novel that they'd written. And it's clear that if we look at aspiring and emerging writers, that this is the biggest issue apart from pay. 39% of underrepresented groups and 10% of those not from underrepresented groups were excluded because of lack of time. they couldn't take up support offers such as mentoring, or they couldn't take up training or courses or whatever, bursaries, whatever it is. A lot of the qualitative responses, a surprising number, were around stories of discrimination and harassment that are actually quite upsetting to read. So 10% said unprompted that they faced discriminatory attitudes. We simply asked them to talk about their career development. This included ageism, racism, sexism, bullying, some particularly unpleasant stories of sexual harassment, and some negative attitudes towards diversity that were around being told that underrepresented groups couldn't possibly write sufficient quality work to be included in the sector. So those were the key barriers. What did writers, illustrators, and sector workers say about overcoming them? Well, there are a huge range of suggestions, a lot of which I'm afraid showed that a lot of aspiring and emerging writers and illustrators didn't really understand how the sector worked. However, the top 5 were mentioned by 15% of that 545 writers and illustrators. That's over 60 people, saying that a universal basic income or a stipend was going to be the key to unlocking their ability to actually write or illustrate and develop their careers. There was a strong feeling that more funding was needed, but that also it wasn't fair the way that bursaries and grants were offered, because aspiring and emerging writers were expected to compete for the same pot of money as mid-career and established writers. There was also felt by a lot of mid-career writers that there was this gap between support for people at the beginning of their career and support for established writers, where they just fell through the net. A lot of writers and illustrators were really, really angry because they felt that they were being exploited by the sector. Some of this was around being expected to work for free to raise their profile, but also they felt that publishers were raking it in and exploiting them by forcing them to accept low fees. Yeah, I think there's a perhaps some lack of understanding of how the market works there, but the genuine anger and upset about it. Support for focused writing time, well, yeah, things like spaces in which people can write, and residencies that focus on creativity rather than community engagement or on teaching. And then action to amplify minority voices, including things like diversity training for the people making decisions around publishing and funding. Sector workers, I don't know. I guess it was there was a level of defeatism coming out from their qualitative comments around what would work in terms of overcoming barriers. So they tended to offer smaller scale, practical suggestions that really, weren't about the big issues that they talked about. So more training opportunities, transparent pay scales, somebody collecting information about what people's pay and conditions were so that they could see what the going rate was, and just simply better pay / more funding that would enable better pay and more, higher fees. So, I don't know, conclusion. This is my conclusion, and I think it's, as an outsider, It's my sort of big picture overview. And that is that actually nothing is going to change around access and overcoming the issues that were emerging from the qualitative comments around well-being and financial security, unless we can pay higher and offer higher fees. And to do that, there needs to be more jobs and more books published. You know, the negative impact on creative output and the well-being of the majority of the people already in the sector is extraordinary. To do that, it means we've got to collaborate, that all stakeholders from all aspects of the sector, the funders, the commercial organisations, the writers and illustrators, we've got to work together to achieve the economic and social and cultural potential of the literature and publishing sector, because I think it's underachieving at the moment. And with some economic development support, actually we could grow this market in this country rather than just simply relying on handouts. Now, as I say, that's a personal view that perhaps the Words Ireland members would not agree with. Anyway, thank you for listening. I've nearly hit my half-hour target, so that wasn't too bad for a 55-page report. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Heather. That was an extraordinary introduction to the report, and I know that I have a lot of questions, and I've had the report for a little while, so I'm conscious that those of you watching haven't had that opportunity. But if any questions arise for you, please put them in the chat, and you can also put your hand up if you want to ask it yourself. But Heather, first of all, can I ask you, before I bring anyone in, it feels like you were surprised to see some of these findings, and can you put them into an international context for us, or into the kind of a historical context? Do you see other flourishing literature sectors that don't have these kinds of issues, or is it fairly similar across different countries?
I think it is to some extent that the issues are the same across different countries. I can talk about the UK in particular. The degree to which pay is low in Ireland and to which some sectors are excluded is much greater in Ireland than it is in the UK. So if you look at some of the research by the literature organisations in the UK, they do look at pay, they do look at where there is exclusion. But this is so extreme, for people, the median earnings from creativity by mid-career and established writers to be €2,000 a year. That is just beggars belief, frankly. I noticed that somebody in the chat is saying they're not surprised, but maybe that's the problem, because the Irish literature sector has just got such a huge international profile and a huge historic background. Actually, you're taking too much for as normal. You're not cross enough.
Okay, yeah. And then what about the kind of the thing flagged between the sector workers and the writers and illustrators, and there being a lack of understanding between those sectors? Can you elaborate on that a little bit as well?
I'm looking at the comments that people make, and there were a lot of writers and illustrators who were saying, really angry at being forced by publishers to take low fees, and feeling that, that actually publishers weren't the ones who were on low pay. There wasn't an understanding of actually that the low pay issue runs right across the sector, not just writers and illustrators. I mean, okay, there are some sector workers who've got a lot more financial security because they're on PAYE contracts. But there are also a lot who are not. And there are a lot of people running small publishing concerns that do it just for the love of it, and probably are subsidizing the publishing from their own sources of income elsewhere.
Okay, great. And yeah, I think this is probably a good time to ask Paul. Paul McVeigh was on our advisory group of 6 writers through this process, and he's a writer, has a portfolio career, of course, as a writer, but also is now the acting head of literature for ACNI. So he has the double perspective, hopefully, of policy and as a writer. Paul, can I ask you initially just for any response you have, any questions you have for Heather?
Well, no, well, first of all, I'll just say, well done to Words Ireland for, sorting this out, preparing it, funding it, going through a very rigorous process in advance to make sure that, it had the best chance to get the information that we needed to make change and to, share that information to with people. And, it was done with that utmost integrity. And, and of course, it was very difficult, and, lots of people giving in their input, and they're very open to listening to people's responses within that process. And, congratulations to Heather. What an extraordinary, thing that you've done here, achieved, like collecting all this information and then, processing it for us. And personally, I take a little bit of time to process information, and, I look forward to that, brain smarter than mine, essentially pulling out all of those threads that are in there individually. So that, that was sort of the overview of that, so the landscape, and I'm really interested in those kind of, those brains that will pull out those threads and make connections and kind of make new things from that information. So for people like me who can absorb it better then, but, yeah, I think it's a really important piece of work. And some of the things that really chimed with me is, that this idea of, as you're an artist, and now, and perhaps it's always been this way, but this just really made it clear that, we're really entrepreneurs, we're like these, businessmen and women who are out there, trying to make, a career. So you're writing, your creativity, it's not that sort of just sitting in your room and writing and people come in and take your book away, and the next thing it's in books, bookshops, and you're touring around and being fabulous and then write your next book. It just doesn't like that. You have to have other strings to your bow, and you have to be out there hustling to make money, because it's very hard out there financially. It's almost impossible to make money just from writing, or make a living and to sustain yourself just from that income, from just writing, from your creativity. There's so much more that goes into being a successful writer, but also being someone who can manage their mortgage. Lots of things were chiming with me personally. I didn't get my first mortgage until I was in my 50s. It's an extraordinary thing to not have a home of your own, until you're nearly dead. So I think it's kind of, that kind of thing is hugely important, because it's a space to write as well. What you also forget within that home, often in shared homes, and you don't have a place to write. And I wrote my novel at the bottom of my bed, with a chair used to hit the bedstead every time I tried to get out, when I tried to write, those kind of things matter. And I really noticed that, that idea of time off to write, or sometimes you've written it because you've been, piecing it together in little snippets of time in your lunch break or on the bus, or, to and from work and everything before the kids come or whatever. But then that time to edit it, to get it that kind of cohesive sort of document that you can then distribute, and then go through the kind of the business side of it, that takes, another massive amount of time, and skill. And then you have to, how are you going to do that when you don't have time, when you're working full time, when you've got all these other pressures? So I just think, it's great that this information's out there. It's great that we can feel a commonality, and we go, this is a shared experience. And, with that information, I'll be really interested to see what Words Ireland can do with that information, what other organizations might be tempted to come in and read and do with that information too. So I'm not sure if that's helpful at all, but that's just my initial responses.
Yeah, and do you see any, do you think there is potentially any different perspective if you're living and working in Northern Ireland?
Well, I mean, my experience, I mean, just in some of the statistics that were coming out there about, wages and earnings and stuff, I think my suspicion is that it's perhaps even lower, actually, the outcomes, the actual earnings here. Even, I mean, just taking small examples, quite often you go to a festival, you could be offered £100 or something to be part of something, whereas it could be 350 euros down south. That's quite a big difference. You're talking maybe 3 times the amount for just as one aspect. And we don't have we don't have a huge amount of publishing infrastructure here up north as well. So you're often looking outside. I mean, we do have some great examples here, but they're not as many as in the rest of the island or in the UK. So we're often looking outwards. I'm not sure. I don't have the information, the statistics to prove any of that, but I think that we probably have it even harder up here, I would say.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to bring in Aoife Walsh now from New Ireland. She's the commissioning editor there. And that idea of the size of the sector and whether we can grow the sector and create more jobs and publish more books. And I can see some questions coming in. Sarah Webb has asked about talking about the book sector underachieving here. And also we have a question from Mia, which is kind of similar, which is there's a lot being published and perhaps we're running to create volume. And it's hard to catch up. Is there a vicious cycle of growth here where the pressure is on quantity rather than quality? So Aoife, anyway, initially, what are your first actions? And then perhaps we can get into the book industry question.
Yeah, so it strikes me, I mean, I think I would consider myself a sector worker through and through. One of the statistics was interesting that 43% of sector workers are or aspire to be a writer, illustrator. I'm not one of those people. I'm a publisher, editor through and through. So it strikes me, this is what we knew, but it writes it large. And I'm working in publishing in lots of different ways since 2005. And the same sort of barriers and difficulties seem to persist. And I think I was just kind of properly getting into my publishing career with the last survey, maybe 10 years ago. So growth is a huge challenge for publishers in Ireland, because we have to consider Ireland to be our first and foremost, our first market. So we publish books for people in Ireland, and not all of those are going to travel, but we try to publish with a view to selling rights and maybe co-publishing with our neighbouring country. But there is a ceiling, and I don't have the economics know-how to figure out how to change that. The business model is that you do try to publish a certain number of books every year. That some of them, that all of them are worth publishing, but that some of them will do better than others. And that's...
Can you talk a little bit about that, about the size of the market in terms of, what your ambition for number of copies sold might be? And I know there's a great range, but could you kind of give an indication of range? Because if Heather is saying that there's that there needs to be more clear information about that for illustrators and for the sector workers, so that we understand each other. Can you talk about that? Like, how many might you print in a first print run, and how in a way success, and what would be good?
Yeah, I mean, I found that really interesting that, I think when we're in publishing, it takes a long time to figure out how to publish. So you're really kind of, I've certainly been really focused on, like, how do you publish? How do you make books? And then you have to, it's good to be reminded that there are people in the industry or feel like they're outside of it who just don't. I told people who work in music, and they're like, how does it work? It does certainly vary, but New Island publishes fiction and non-fiction. We publish a little bit of poetry, we've published drama in the past. We do find that non-fiction will sell in greater numbers. And so with, you know, with fiction, maybe with debut fiction or maybe later fiction, you are looking at somewhere around 1,500 to 2,000 copies in a first print run, which might drop some jaws. But that is,
and you follow,
you know,
through in terms of what kind of class of a royalty might come from that if the book is €20 in the shop. And it's all ranges, of course.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I should know this now because I do contracts with my colleague Marielle, but we're looking at like 12-15% royalty, but it can really, it does vary, but it's kind of hovering in around there. And then
a net or a book, like if the book's a tenner, how much will an author make out of it in general?
That's a really good. I don't know that.
Okay, yeah. So I could talk about not as a non-fiction publisher. You might, if you have a net royalty agreement, and a book was a tenner, you might, after your net cost might be you might receive a £5, and then from that maybe the author is only making 50 cents from that. So it breaks down very low by the time it comes to the writer.
Yeah, it is, and it's really hard to hear that. I know, making books is expensive and it is laborious and it is time consuming. It's one of the it's one of the reasons I love working in editorial, because it is so kind of physical. Like editorial hasn't really changed an awful lot, but it does. It takes time to edit a book. It takes time to put it together. So the upfront costs for a publisher are quite high, and we have to account for those. So they are intrinsically linked to what our expectations of how much a book might sell, and what price we should sell it at, so that return is respectable.
Yeah. And Heather, yeah, you talked about growing the industry rather than growing the funding or necessarily relying on payouts. In that context of having an ambition of maybe selling 2,000 within this market, and perhaps it's not for you to answer really, but based on the questions that people or the things that people were saying, were there any other suggestions within that you think might be useful here?
Sorry, are you asking Heather?
I'm asking Heather this. Do you see we might grow the sector?
Reader development, and that's reader development in terms of the not in terms of access to reading, but in terms of persuading people that Irish writers are worth reading, just broadly, and I haven't seen any of that. I'm really concerned by the discounting issue, because it strikes me that because you have so many very small publishers, actually and you don't work together necessarily, you don't have any negotiating power, and actually discounting is one of the big things that's driving what writers and illustrators are paid and what publishers can make. Right down, and then I just, having seen what's happened to, say, animation or to other creative sectors in terms of developing the market for that work, a small amount of economic development support, rather than from the government, economic development about trade rather than about culture, actually makes the most phenomenal difference. Actually, you can completely change the profile and Northern Ireland has been particularly good at this with a lot of aspects of the creative industries, punching way beyond its weight. But the natural response of the Irish literature and publishing sector, apart from a very small number of big commercial players, is to go for funding rather than actually saying, you know, how can we sell more books? Let's look at the big long term rather than next year. Let's look 10 years. How can we double the market in 10 years? You know?
Yeah, sure. And then the other aspect of it would be the concept of pay the artist. Is Toby here? Toby Dennett, who's the Strategic Development Manager at the Arts Council. I was just hoping you might fill us in a little bit on the work that you've been doing and the policy that you have. If you can turn your camera on.
I'm on, yeah.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, so thanks, Heather. That's a really valuable contribution to this debate, and a really solid piece of research. And I think, you know, that it sits alongside other pieces of similar research. I was at the event yesterday where you obviously we're talking about the Theatre Forum research as well. So I think there's been other work going on in visual arts as well. And we've done our own pieces of research and pieces of surveys in recently as well. So I think it's really good to see all of this coming together, and a number of these pieces, I suppose, contributing to that discussion across the sectors, because although each of these sectors have their individual, I suppose, bespoke issues, many of the underlying and the common themes are, you know, they run across all these areas. You know, I think particularly from this piece of research, I think, you know, I was, you know, you're struck, you know, not so much by the low levels of income. I mean, I think we're kind of common, we're used to seeing that, but I think that's that income from the creative aspect, that really, I think was pretty significantly low and less than I might have expected to see coming through there. And I think that does really talk to, I guess, that issue of continued subsidy, and the extent to which that can always fill the gap. I know that I saw it in the responses in terms of what might be the solutions to this, that the UBI or more bursaries or more investment or opening up bursaries to more people, you know, and yes, those things are important, and certainly, you know, it's fantastic to see that the government announced funding for that basic income guarantee scheme in the budget, and that we have also been able to invest greater amounts in our bursaries and being able to separate out perhaps into the emerging writer sector more as well in recent years as well. So that's all helped. But I think that issue of how far that can go, how sustainable is that long term, is really important. And that is, I suppose, the key issue that was underpinning the Pay the Artist policy. That it wasn't really, the Pay the Artist policy was not about more investment in grants. It was about when artists are doing work, when artists are commissioned or published, or their works are being distributed, that they are able to benefit from that, to share in the economic, I suppose, the economic value of what they are creating. And I would be conscious that at the minute, I think everyone seems to be aware of the basic income guarantee scheme, or have heard of that. But at the same time, we have a European directive. A European directive is a piece of law that is made in Europe, in Brussels, which every country in Europe has to apply. And there is currently this EU directive that is to be, or should have already been implemented here, but it hasn't actually been implemented, around the digital single market. So not all, obviously applies, not all of what we're talking about here is in the digital context, but there are significant implications or possibilities that arise from that. And that within that directive, there is a whole chapter called The Fair Remuneration in Exploitation Contracts of Authors and Performers. So there's a whole chapter in this directive on how artists can be or should be better paid. And it feels to me that very few people are conscious or aware of that. We have made submissions to government to try and ensure that that directive is implemented appropriately. Now it's difficult because it's responsibility for that is with Departments for Enterprise, Trade and Employment rather than through arts. But if that was implemented properly, it gives a legislative legal basis for artists to be better paid, to earn more income from their work. It provides that the principle of appropriate and proportionate remuneration, it puts that in a legislative basis. It ensures that authors must receive information about how their work is exploited, and it provides for what's called an alternative dispute resolution procedure and contract adjustment mechanism, so that if what you are paid at a certain stage in your career actually turns out to be really low compared with what the work goes on to create in the future, becomes a great success, sells more than you actually imagined when you signed the contract, it provides for an adjustment to that. These are all things which could be really impact long-term in artists' careers, ability to earn income from what they create, rather than this kind of short-termism is in terms of the next bursary or subsidy through the basic income guarantee scheme. Now, we do support those things because I think they have a real role to play, particularly in the research development sort of phase of what an artist do and their career. But I think it's disproportionate, the amount of, I suppose, focus that perhaps goes on that aspect. And I think, the sector really needs to get behind some of the other aspects of developing the industry and those long-term potential to actually earn income from what you own, what you create, your assets, your copyright. And I think that is absolutely crucial and critical.
Okay, thank you. That'd be great if you can, I don't know if you have it to hand, but perhaps you could share a link in the chat, or we can share it afterwards on our website so that people can have a look at that. And I suppose seeing the low income from sector workers and knowing the size of the publishing industry, that many publishing houses only have a few people working there, often it can be difficult for them to keep abreast of things like a directive coming from the EU. So any collective or collaborative effort that either Words Ireland or the Arts Council can do to support publishers to become aware of that, I think will be really, really useful. And I think as well, your Pay the Artist policy, I have seen changes in government departments' approach to inviting people, writers and others to participate. So I'd like to commend you for that. And I see that you define an artist as independent workers, sector workers as well. So that is something that will be of interest, I think, to people. So I'm just having a look in the chat before perhaps we turn. I'd like to spend a little bit of time moving away from the pay and conditions and the barriers of time, which are clearly fundamental in this research, but to return to the question of the underrepresented groups and inclusion. So if anyone has any questions on that, and equally if any of the Words Ireland organisation heads would like to comment at this point, either on what you're doing yourselves in terms of underrepresented groups. I know that there's work going on at the moment, or responses to the survey, please let me know, and I'll call on you now if you could do it. Yeah, so I see Grania O'Toole is asking, I wonder if you have any recommendations about targeting communities who were underrepresented in the survey. Also, was building new audiences for books considered as a strategy which could come from the production of more books from writers traditionally underrepresented? So Heather, were there any, in the broader questions, were there any other recommendations? I know you gave us the kind of most mentioned barriers for underrepresented communities, but were there any good suggestions in there on how to work with underrepresented communities?
The key barriers are that underrepresented groups are underrepresented because of the issue around low pay, which then leads to issues around not having time to develop your career or to take advantage of any of the wonderful development opportunities that Words Ireland members offer. Unless we can sort out the pay issue, I just don't see how it's possible for a lot of underrepresented groups to enter the sector. It's just so incredibly competitive. The thought that you need to have a master's and to have worked for free for a year to get your first job within the literature and publishing sector is unanswerable. I mean, how do you overcome that unless you resolve the low pay issue? And that requires, I think Gronya's point about, infrastructure focused investment is essential. That's what we need. We need to tackle this problem by making fundamental changes to the structure of the industry, and that's going to require everybody to work together to identify how that can happen and what that change needs to be. So, hallelujah that you've got an organisation like Words Ireland, which brings so many organisations together. But actually, let's sit round the table with everybody and try and bash this out.
Yeah, and we are very hopeful that this Charter of Inclusion that we're developing and these 3 webinars that we're going to hold now for the sector, again, to have a conversation about this, because this is only a beginning. This is only or a continuation, because of course there was a survey 10 years ago, and this pay was an issue more than a decade ago as well, and artists, writers didn't reach the average income at that point either. So it is something that needs to be fixed structurally and will take time. But I do think that this step that Words Ireland have taken should be valuable. And I'd like at this point to bring Nolene Hartigan in, who I mentioned at the beginning is a consultant in this area and is working with Words Ireland organisations on their own strategies, but is also developing a Charter of Inclusion. And then I'll take the chance to have a look at any specific questions about this area relating to the research, and we might wrap around to that before we conclude. But Nolene, can I hand over to you now?
Hi, thank you, Ruth. So firstly, I can't see myself on screen, so I assume I'm being heard. You can give me a wave, lovely. So thank you, Ruth. It's a great pleasure to be involved in this project. And as everyone can see, both from the questions in the chat box and from the very interesting nature of Heather's research, we are all learning right now, and we're learning together. My role in this project, and it's a year-long project funded by the Arts Council, was to do 2 things. One was to work on a framework for the organisations within Words Ireland on how they can systemically, if you like, approach the questions of human rights, diversity, equality and inclusion in their organisations. And then secondly, to help people draft a charter for inclusion that would really set out what the Words Ireland organisation's values and commitments are. Why I mentioned the framework is because in many ways they are the back end and the front end of the same process. So just for a second, because I think it speaks to some of the questions coming up in the chat box, in the framework, what we've looked at is not just how we're paying people or how we're engaging people, but a top to bottom, bottom to top approach for the organisations. So we actually look at what values underpin the organisations in the sector, what their governance standards are, how they're responding to equality, diversity and inclusion in their human resources strategies, how they're building the capacity of their boards, their staff, their volunteers to actually understand in depth the rapidly changing debate. Then we also look at programs with artists and programs with audiences and that question of audience development and outreach. But we also look at questions like impact. If you are going down the route of, for example, a mentoring program or specific outreach program, or working with a particular community or communities, can you prove that that's making any difference? And where are the people that are benefiting from that work, and where is their voice in actually assessing your progress? And ultimately communications, because it's not just the works that get published, but the way that we tell those stories. So if you like, that's the homework that the Words Ireland organizations are doing together in the background. And we're working through our own sort of almost strategic planning process, if you like, of looking at equality, diversity and inclusion across every element of an organization. And then the charter is the public piece. And if someone might share the charter on screen very briefly, we're going to have a series of 3 webinars, and we'll put the details up about those later, where we're going to specifically look at the Charter for Inclusion. Peter has started screen sharing. I'm just going to keep talking. What we've tried to do with this charter, oh lovely, thank you Peter, is find something that is powerful enough to be meaningful, but not so aspirational that everyone can sign up to it and then do absolutely nothing about it. So it's been kind of interesting getting that balance right. But in brief, this is where the charter is at right now. It really does reflect that homework that we did on the framework and all the different places that Words Ireland member organisations need to think about diversity and inclusion. So we start with the power of storytelling, because all the literature would say you can have all the diversity strategies in the world, but actually personal testimony and listening to and genuinely empathizing with the other is how we own other people. And we're in the business of telling stories. Literature is in the business of telling stories. So we start by talking about the power of stories. You'll see there in the top, in the right-hand box, there's a commitment to making a genuinely inclusive, fair and vibrant and progressive sector. A specific acknowledgement of the right to participate in the cultural life of the community. So we've named the human right to participate in culture very clearly in our work. And for those that are still new to that framework, that isn't just like the right to read a book or write a book or show up to the Abbey or get up the stairs with a ramp. It's really about acknowledging people's innate right to express themselves creatively, to have their stories told, and as others mentioned earlier, to actually be remunerated for your work. The third area is simply and explicitly mentioning the grounds of discrimination covered under the equality legislation and the Arts Council policy. But then we acknowledge that to do this, we have to approach this systematically across our organisations, both to protect and support and advocate for underrepresented writers and illustrators, but also those who work in the sector. And the final part of the charter, and this will be the most challenging to get right, is to say that none of this happens in a vacuum. And particularly in a very small country like Ireland, we cannot hope for change in the literature sector and then ignore the fact that Ireland is a country that has been, systematically abusive of women, with high levels of racism, a rising right, endemic poverty, all the social problems that are still here in Ireland. And even if we get it right in the literature sector, or at least we open our hearts and our minds towards striving for our best at all times, the writers and illustrators and staff that we work with will continue to live in a world that is sexist and racist and will face significant challenges. And so how do we as a sector stand shoulder to shoulder when we do promote a writer or a story or an event to make sure that that person isn't left to face what's going on in the world alone? Now that will be challenging for us to get right, but this is where we're at with the charter right now. A number of people have offered their views on this and got it to this stage of words that it is now. What we will do with it is at the first of our 3 webinars, we have 3 lovely new webinars coming up responding to this whole debate. On the 2nd of November, we'll have a webinar just on the Charter. On the 16th of November, we'll have one on what's happening in the literature sector. So a lot of those questions that were raised in the chat box, like James's question about where are we going with a greater and deeper understanding of the issues around trans rights, they can be answered there. And then this third webinar, we're actually going to look at what's happening in the wider arts sector. We can't just bury our heads in literature and think we're making a difference. So we're very lucky we have the time and space to debate this, and we'll take people's feedback on the Charter, good, bad and indifferent, live in those webinars. And it is our plan that at the end of the year, the Words Ireland organisations will regroup, assess any changes that they need to make to the Charter, and then adopt it both collectively and individually for their organisations. And it may well be that other organisations or individuals like the final formula of words and want to sign up to that in their own way as well.
Thank you very much, Nolene. And yes, it begins to address how we're going to learn to start to look at some of the questions raised by the research and more generally. And yes, you responded to James there. And I also see a suggestion that perhaps we would consult with the Irish Trans Writers Union as part of this process, or make sure that they're invited to these webinars so that we can have an open conversation with as many voices as possible before we arrive at any conclusions. I also see that that Sam Holman has shared an update from Enterprise about the transposition of the directive. If anyone's interested, they can pick it up there in the chat, and we'll share it on our website as well. If anyone has any final questions, please shout now. I see Ronan Colgan, publisher, says that the IPA, the International Publishers Association, has just launched the Inspire Charter on Economic Sustainability and Diversity in the industry, which might be interesting. And of course, we're all learning together, and we do not need to reinvent the wheel. So if we can share and collaborate and learn together, it's the only way that a sector such as this, which is small and many people working individually, will be able to be successful.
Sorry, Ruth, if I could just
maybe
follow up with a couple of observations from kind of publisher point of view. Some of the statistics that struck me was that there's not a lot of people under the age of 24 working and being paid in the literature sector, whether it's with publishers or otherwise. And there's not a lot of people, I think it was over the age of 55. So there is a really big problem of getting into the industry in the first place, and a really big problem staying in the industry. And as somebody who's in it 15, 16 years, you know, I've kind of come to that crossroads a few times. And I think the way that we talk about change, which is, you know, related to everything, it's about, you know, the books that we publish, the stories that we tell, you know, all of those parts that speak to that charter, require an active decentering ourselves, and that has to be part of the learning. So I, you know, worked really hard to get where I am, but I did do, you know, I worked voluntarily. I moved to another country to intern for basically no pay, in order to come back more qualified and to be a more sort of attractive candidate and to bring experience from other territories. And, you know, one of the systems that I took part in that other country in Canada was an internship that was directly fed from publishing courses, not necessarily undergraduate or postgraduate. You could be kind of coming from anywhere, but you would not be eligible for an internship without being a part of that those courses, night courses, or however way you wanted to do them. So this is about, you know, an ecosystem. I would dearly love to see us who are working in publishing to diversify itself, because I think that it follows that the work that we are looking at and that we choose to publish will change and diversify. And, you know, hopefully then it means that market that we've talked about, which is incredibly difficult to grow, because work is either too Irish or it's not Irish enough. And we do have an enormous neighbour beside us. that, you know, we try to work with. And the legacy of that is long and felt deeply. But, you know, I see our capacity to open up that market, to publish work that's attractive, not only here but elsewhere, is intrinsically linked to those who are the gatekeepers, which is, you know, a lot of us here. So if I have a wish, you know, my takeaway from these kinds of events is always, how do we make the industry more attractive for people to get into? And I'm strictly speaking from, you know, a publisher, you know, editorial, sales, marketing, because that is my remit at the moment. Because I saw it in Canada, you know, even it wasn't a perfect system. People got in, they stayed a few years, it took too long, they moved to the baseball team because the pay was just going to be, they could do the same kind of work but for baseball. So we do need to work together. I'd like to see that kind of incubation feeder system. The Words Ireland mentoring program earlier this year was incredible, and I really enjoyed taking part in it. I did have to take a break from it because the day-to-day of being a small publisher is just a lot of firefighting. So
yeah, so
if I could just express a deeply felt desire to help and to change. But first and foremost, you know, I say that I worked really hard to get here, but I recognize the privilege that supported me in figuring out how to crack an industry that appears to still be quite opaque.
yes.
And to a lot of people quite elitist, you know. But I would say to anyone on the outside looking in, you know, you can be in the industry 10, 15 years and you do have your moments where you wonder how much more fumes can you run on, you know, but you go back in because you do love it. And I think we're reaching a sort of a point where we realize that love of it, that passion for books, that vocational aspect is incredible, but it is very easily taken advantage of. So
and that's, thank you very much. That's probably a great place to finish up, to say that none of us can live on fumes alone. And that if we can build a diverse, empathetic, rich sector, how we do that is in our hands now and up for discussion. So thank you all. Thank you to all of the speakers. I'd like to share now the details of the webinar. Please come to the Words Ireland website this afternoon where you can download the full report. You can read it. You'll be able to watch this back. It will be posted. The recording will be posted possibly tomorrow. And we hope you'll sign up for the webinars and join us at that point. And thank you to all of you, to the sector, to the publishers, the policymakers, the writers, the illustrators, resource organizations, everyone. Thank you all very much and goodbye.